Charlotte Thomas that nobody goes over 15 minutes in their presentation. And that meant I had to spend a whole day cutting mine down to 14 and a half. My suggestion is at 13 minutes, I will give you a 2-minute warning as in football, and that means it's time to wrap up. Once we're done with our remarks, I think we should reserve a little bit of time just to talk about what on earth a possession for all time might mean. That's the thing that holds this together. And then we can open up for conversation with the rest of the audience. I figure I will go in alphabetical order and save myself to the very end, which will put me out of alphabetical order, but it makes sure everybody else on the team has a chance to speak. That means Jose, are you up for going first, since your name is with an A?
Okay, hold on a second.
All right, let me make sure I got my my timer working.
Sure.
All right, Jose, you can go.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you for agreeing to chair this. I appreciate the flexibility involved. My paper is on the thought of John Henry Newman and Friedrich Schelling, who were both trying to come up with the idea of a new university around the same time. Schelling was a little bit, maybe 20 years before Newman, but they were both pursuing a new ideal of the university. And in their reflections on the principles that undergird the university, John Henry Newman and Friedrich Schelling both argue that the centrality of the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake is at the core. Newman argues that, quote, knowledge is capable of being its own end. Such is the constitution of the human mind that any kind of knowledge, if it be really such, is its own reward. Schelling claims that the role of the university is to pursue systematic knowledge, and that, quote, scholarship and the sciences cease to be systematic knowledge as soon as they are reduced to mere means and not fostered for their own sake. So despite this apparent agreement, Newman and Schelling have a different understanding of knowledge. And this difference in understanding changes what it means to pursue knowledge for its own sake. Newman's conception of knowledge centers on man and what is good for man. And Schelling goes beyond this strictly human realm. For him, knowledge is not simply a good for man, it is the ultimate good and intrinsically linked to the divine. So for Schelling, the pursuit of knowledge is not only a good in itself, but it's the ultimate good. Newman argues that the pursuit of knowledge in a university must be liberal, as opposed to servile. This is a common distinction in liberal education. So something is liberal when it's done for its own sake, and servile when it's done for the sake of something that is outside of its own ends. So Newman gives the example of theology. If theology is pursued for the purpose of preaching, it loses its liberal character. So Newman's argument is anthropocentric. Knowledge has an intrinsic value, which means it's intrinsically good for man. In pursuing knowledge, he says, quote, we are satisfying a direct need for our nature in its very acquisition. So Newman describes this good as, quote, an acquired illumination, a habit, a personal possession, and an inward endowment. And this maybe links to the theme of our panel. So knowledge is a condition of the mind, not just a piece of information. It's a habit that perfects man's intellect, and this perfection is intrinsically good. So this anthropocentric focus comes into view when Newman discusses the need for an academic community. And this is going to tie into our contemporary situation. He says that given the choice between a university that gives out basic information and then awards degrees based on proficiency, and one that, quote, had no professors or examinations at all, but merely brought a number of young men together for 3 or 4 years and then sent them away. The latter would better accomplish the ends of a liberal education. Newman explains that, quote, when a multitude of young men, keen, open-hearted, sympathetic, and observant, come together and freely mix with each other, they are sure to learn from one another, even if there be no one to teach them. The conversation of all is a series of lectures to each, and they gain for themselves new ideas and new views, fresh matter for thought, and the distinct principles for judging and acting day by day. So a community of thought needs to live together. Applying this to our contemporary situation, this living together became impossible in institutions that prohibited in-person classes and went online for the course of the past year. So from this perspective, at these institutions, liberal education was actually stunted. Newman argues that people need this community for their education. And this is any education, be it liberal or illiberal. He says that there are, quote, few indeed who can dispense with the stimulus and support of instructors or a community, or will do anything at all if left to themselves, end quote. Because of our human weaknesses and the limitations that the community and limitations, the community helps build a necessary interdependence between its members. Free conversation in this intellectual environment more readily exposes the deficiencies of one's own knowledge and inspires a hunger for truth and cultivating the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. Here too, Newman recognizes the weaknesses of human nature and builds his idea of a university around what man needs to pursue knowledge for its own sake. In contrast to this, Schelling's analysis begins beyond the scope of the human. And he eventually does come around to this academic community, but when he looks at the principles that undergird university education, Schelling frequently mentions things that are abstracted from the human experience by applying the term absolute. So he talks about things like absolute wisdom or absolute power or absolute freedom, absolute necessity, and he attributes these all to the divine. And by the term absolute, Schelling means to say that something is complete and has no need to refer to anything outside of itself. Only in God can these characteristics be complete without limits. And this pursuit of the absolute is at the core of the university. So Schelling, so if God is eternal, he must exist for his own sake. And if his knowledge is absolute, then absolute knowledge must also be pursued for its own sake. And so this is probably the most profound way in which Schelling presents knowledge as being pursued for its own sake. But turning to a more grounded perspective, both Newman and Schelling agree that for knowledge to be truly liberal, it must have intrinsic unity. And unity is kind of another attribute of the divine for Schelling. Newman affirms this as well by arguing that, quote, not to know the relative dispositions of things is the state of slaves or children. To have mapped out the universe is to boast or at least the ambition of philosophy. So in other words, students must understand the relationship between the various areas of knowledge in order to be liberally educated. Experiences must be, quote, impregnated by reason, end quote, according to Newman, to be truly knowledge. The search for these relationships thus form an essential part of the habit of knowledge. This is another contribution that the community makes to pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. relationships between students become the conduits for understanding the whole of knowledge. Schelling makes a similar point to this, saying that because knowledge is the divine in itself, it also has a unitive or absolute quality. For man, this unity has a practical implication in his pursuit of it. The unity, understanding the unity is his, quote, access point to all systematic knowledge. So, in other words, without unity, nothing can actually be known, according to Schelling. For him, unity of knowledge is the premise for all human understanding, and without it, the human mind is just chaos. So, for Schelling, quote, any thought not conceived of in the spirit of unity and universality is intrinsically empty and worthless. So, like Newman, Schelling argues that a partial view of knowledge is illiberal and slavish, but he goes beyond this. He says that whoever is unable to recognize the relationship of unity in knowledge feel himself forsaken, for he, quote, prefers him to isolate himself from the living whole, end quote. So this adds a communal aspect to liberal learning that is also present in Newman's understanding. Man's capacity is limited and therefore can only come to understand to the understanding of the whole through others. So Schelling describes the pursuit of knowledge as a spiritual rapture in which man engages in a movement from one's particular area of study to a spiritual unity through the academic community. From the perspective of man, Schelling undergirds the centrality of the pursuit of knowledge with the principle that, quote, all knowledge is a striving towards communion with the divine being. So while man might think he is pursuing knowledge for his own sake, that pursuit may intrinsically imply an ulterior end, which is the communion with the divine. So Schelling calls God the idea, which seems to imply that the central attribute of the divine is knowledge. So what's clear for Schelling is that all knowledge is a striving towards communion with the divine being, and that the pursuit of knowledge is at least capable of being, if not synonymous, with the highest end of man. Quote, he says, a person must be gripped by the spirit of the whole and conceive of his particular science as part of that organic whole. Those without this view of the whole are isolated, exiled, or even damned. So a person in this community is necessary for salvation even. So this makes sense in light of Schelling's spiritual understanding of the pursuit of knowledge. Those who aren't privy to it are cut off from the idea or from God, and therefore the community is a fundamental part of man's participation in God. This conclusion is curious in light of the fact that both Schelling and Newman recognize that philosophic learning, which is required for this unitive view of knowledge, is not for everyone. So this actually implies that for Schelling, salvation is limited to a select few who are able to grasp absolute knowledge within the academic community. Newman, on the other hand, is very careful to separate the perfection of the intellect from man's ultimate end. He says that he says that, quote, what the worth of such an achievement is, the perfection of the intellect, I do not profess to discuss here in his idea of the university. He does not explain how we should evaluate the good of the perfection of the intellect in relation to other goods. The most that Newman says on this point is that acquiring universal knowledge is, quote, the highest state to which nature can aspire in the way of the intellect. So this is high praise, but man is more than his intellect. Man, according to Newman, is meant for the eternal. Yet philosophic knowledge is, quote, but a temporal object, a transitory possession. A liberal education can do little to temper man's passions and help him acquire moral virtue. Because Newman recognizes that, quote, a liberal education does not make the Christian, not the Catholic, more is needed to reach man's ultimate end. He needs God's grace, faith, and charity, and ordinarily, he also, according to Newman, needs incorporation into the Catholic Church. So all these things go beyond the goals of liberal education, according to Newman. In addition to these differences about the nature of knowledge, there's also a profound epistemological difference. For Schelling, the spiritual rapture, which is intrinsic to the pursuit of knowledge, requires a detachment from material things. Echoing Kant, Schelling argues that in the pursuit of theoretical ideas, quote, there is nothing more harmful or undignified than the appeal to experience, because these experiences depend on preconceived ideas that shape them, end quote. If those ideas then were different, the experience of a person will also be different. So therefore, for a man, true knowledge must begin in the a priori, which then shapes his experience. Newman rejects this separation of experience from knowledge. He states that, quote, when I speak of knowledge, I mean something intellectual, which grasps what it perceives through the senses. If knowledge begins in the senses, then it must begin with experience. So for Newman, both the origin and the end of knowledge are more limited than for Schelling. All these differences amount to an institutional difference in the idea of a university for Newman and Schelling. Though Schelling does not discuss salvation, it seems that for him, the university replaces the church as a means to it. Through the university, one can attain a, quote, genuinely blessed life. For Newman, his perspective on the university is much more sober. He separates the university from the church. And while he argues that the two are certainly not opposed, they have different ends, and that of the church is clearly higher. Thank you. You're muted.
Well done in a timely fashion. Again, I said we'd go alphabetically. So Mike, it looks like you're up.
All right, thank you. So as we got started and we're talking, I thought, I'm not sure how related my topic is to this panel, but as Jose got going, I became more clear on what the connections were. So we'll see what happens. I'm excited for the discussion. So my paper was titled 9 Parts of 10, Man's Malleable Character and the Importance of Good Education. I may have fooled a couple of people because good probably should have been moral, but we'll see where that goes. It is difficult to deny the emphatic importance of moral education in the thought of John Locke. In fact, Locke says that, quote, of all the men we meet with, 9 parts of 10 are what they are, good or evil, useful or not, by their education, end quote. While it is clear from the statement that Locke believes education to be important, it says nothing about why it is important. The answer to this was given in an earlier part of the same section. Locke opens some thoughts concerning education with the following statement. Quote, a sound mind in a sound body is a short but full description of a happy state in this world. He that has these two has little more to wish for, end quote. So in brief, the goal of life for Locke is happiness. Locke continues by saying that man's happiness or misery is a derivative of the soundness or unsoundness of his mind and body. He whose mind directs not wisely will never take the right way to happiness, and he whose body is crazy and feeble will never be able to advance in it. It would seem that in Locke's framework, a happy man is a good, moral man whose body is strong enough to assist his mind in the pursuit of happiness. So my presentation will argue that according to Locke, a good moral education is necessary for a happy human life. To demonstrate this, I'll first describe the natural human condition with regard to moral knowledge as Locke sees it. Second, explain the challenges to right reasoning and the acquisition of knowledge. And third, I'll enumerate some of the key elements of the Lockean moral education and explain their importance. Locke suggests that there are 2 primary elements of man's natural condition that make moral living difficult. Our lack of innate moral principles, knowledge of innate moral principles, and the strength of human passions. Both of these problems are described in Book 1 of an essay concerning human understanding. Regarding the first, Locke famously or infamously asserts that men at their birth lack innate practical principles, that is, moral knowledge. For the sake of time, I'll only mention one of the main pieces of evidence Locke proffers against men having innate practical principles. That is the lack of historical evidence for the existence of such principles. According to Locke, the closest thing to moral principles revealed by historical observation is the tendency of men to keep contracts, which he calls justice. Some say that justice is universal because it is practiced both by the law-abiding citizen and by the brigand. However, Locke does not see this as being a universal truth implanted on all men's souls, but rather as, quote, rules of convenience, end quote, that govern these different communities. It cannot be a universal rule imprinted on men's souls because although criminals practice justice with their fellows, they live by fraud and rapine in relation to everyone else. Conversely, while Locke argues that historical experience does not support the existence of an innate moral code, experience does reveal the pervasiveness of human passions. These passions, or natural appetites, are principles for action, indeed, according to Locke, but they are, quote, so far from being moral principles that if they were left to their full swing, they would carry men to the overturning of morality, end quote. Locke offers a parallel sentiment in the first treatise, where he says that when man quits his reason, his busy mind will carry him to a brutality below the level of beasts. The only way to curb this tendency is to implement moral laws, which will serve as curbs and restraints to man's exorbitant desires. These laws must be promulgated and make offers of rewards or punishments that will overbalance, as Locke says, the satisfaction a man thinks he might get for breaking the law. Because men do not feel an innate urgency to abide by such a law, it does not make sense to say that there is an innate law of moral conduct universally binding on all men. If there were, it would have to be accompanied by an innate gospel, as he says, that would give clear evidence to all men of the punishments due for their transgressions. So the above arguments stating that man lacks moral knowledge leads Locke to another conclusion for which he is famous, that all knowledge comes from experience. And this is where I think we get into Jose's comments a little bit. Locke says that the mind of man is like, quote, white paper, void of all characters, end quote, when he is born. Thus, the only manner by which ideas and notions can be written on that blank slate is through observation. It is tempting to conclude that since Locke rejects the notion of innate moral knowledge, that he is therefore morally relativistic. However, despite this rejection, Locke affirms the existence of a law of nature in the following way. I'll quote this at length. He says, I would not be here mistaken, as if because I deny an innate law, I thought there were none but positive laws. There is a great deal of difference between an innate law and a law of nature, between something imprinted on our minds in their very original, and something we, being ignorant of, attain to the knowledge of by the use and due application of our natural faculties. This statement provides two essential considerations. First, Locke assumes that the law of nature is knowable by our natural faculties, namely reason. This necessarily implies the need for experience to fill our understandings with the content that reason requires to draw its conclusions. Second, the attainment of moral knowledge requires the use or exercise of our faculties. The possession of reason is not in itself enough. We must exercise our reason properly if we are to attain true knowledge of the moral law. However, Locke says that such exercise is difficult. Locke admits in the second treatise that while men can know the law of nature via their rational faculties, most fail to grasp it on account of ignorance or personal prejudices. Likewise, in his On the Conduct of the Understanding, Locke laments that most men come up very short of their intellectual potential by a neglect of their understandings. That is, a failure to properly exercise their faculties. However, while Locke seems to suggest that all we need to do is exercise our reason, it turns out that there are many obstacles to obtain a robust understanding of reality and the ability to reason rightly. Locke describes three main miscarriages that men are guilty of in reference to their reason, but for time, I'll just focus on the third. This third miscarriage is the tendency of men to act on only partial knowledge. This is a sort of short-sightedness which comes from the limits placed on our knowledge by our own local prejudices. For Locke, prejudice is a particularly dangerous hindrance to right reasoning because it is not chosen for its merits, but it is rather imbibed from one's education, interest, and customs. Thus, if one's customs are bad, his reasoning will be poor and in some cases even contrary to the natural law. A good example from Locke's writings of a people whose customs were corrupt is the Peruvians, who raised their children in order to, quote, fatten and eat them, end quote. Customs are also especially effective for occupying human psychology because the failure to observe customary behavior results in shaming or ostracization. So to this point, I've detailed some of the many challenges to right reasoning that Locke describes in his writings. We should now harken back to the purpose of education that we described at the beginning. Remember that Locke told us the goal of education was happiness, and the means to happiness in this life was a sound mind and a sound body. What should be clear by now is the difficulty of fostering a sound mind. Our minds are constantly beset by obstacles that make reasoning a challenge and therefore threatens the possibility for our happiness. We are now poised to see just how important a proper moral education is for the Lockean conception of happiness. This requires training in moral virtue, which allows reason to pursue happiness in the right way. Virtue for Locke is a man's ability to, quote, deny himself his own desires, cross his own inclinations, and purely follow what reason dictates, end quote. By this statement, Locke is reminding us that man is both a body and a soul, or a mind, and that virtue requires training in both areas. So I'll now give a brief summary of some of the ways in which Locke thinks such an education should be conducted. Locke says that due care must be given to the strengthening of the body so that it may be able to obey and execute the orders of the mind. The body must be toughened so as not to capitulate when faced with discomforts. Thus, Locke suggests that children be made in moderation to experience the harshness of the climate. This may be accomplished by allowing them to run around barefoot or by wearing thin shoes that will allow cold water to soak their feet. Concomitantly, Locke suggests that children be given plainer foods when they are young so that their palates are not so attached to greater delicacies. A reliance on simpler foods like, quote, well-made and well-baked brown bread, end quote, will teach temperance, a virtue important both for health and for business. Along with the development of this physical endurance, one must build the more distinctly moral character of a child. The true starting point for the moral education is to foster a genuine reverence in children for their father and for God, according to Locke. These two will act as sources for the moral law, as each can enforce punishments for the failure to comply. The father, who would gain his son's reverence, must teach them that he is to be feared, but that fear must stem from a love that gives a child implicit confidence that the father sees him as a person who will one day be his equal. This is why Locke counsels fathers to view their children as future rational creatures. Children must be shown that while they are subjects of their fathers now, as is fitting, they must have hope that they will be dad's affectionate friend when they are grown. The severity of the father's governance should relax as the child's reason and virtue develops, allowing the child to reason for himself as he becomes more adept. This relationship with his father will also instill in the child a desire for a good reputation, a desire that will make the father's correctives more effective as the child grows, and thus teach the child to love the ways of virtue. In addition to being taught love and reverence for the father, a child must also be taught love and reverence for God. Locke says that the foundation of virtue is the true notion of God, the, quote, independent supreme being, author and maker of all things, from whom we receive our good, who loves us and gives us all things, end quote. The love of God is the true touchstone of all morality, because that love makes us obedient to the laws of God, which instruct us in how to be good on earth so that we may enjoy perfect bliss in heaven. Short of further intellectual training, the education Locke prescribes for both the body and the mind can serve to help men attain true happiness in both this life and the next. In conclusion, I think Locke's views on education can be instructive for showing us how and where modern American education has gone awry. Our education does not concern itself with the moral development of future citizens, as our focus on specialization and preparedness for standardized tests indicates. America would benefit from the education that Locke describes, an education that teaches children how to be strong citizens and good neighbors and to love the things they ought. In short, they need to be taught how to pursue happiness. Only on this moral foundation can reason properly do its work. Thank you. I think you're on now.
Yeah. I told you I was, I'm a techno idiot. I just wanted to say that my mentor at the University of Chicago was Nathan Tarkoff. And I got to study Locke's thoughts concerning education with him, and it was mind-blowing.
That's wonderful. That's awesome.
I should say that the backstory is somehow people have reached out to Gregory Smith, but we haven't found a way to contact him. Amy, if you could go next, and I'll come clean up.
I think you're muted.
Am I muted or unmuted? Let's see. I'm so sorry. Okay, I should be unmuted now. Is that correct? Can everyone
Yeah,
hear?
we can hear you.
You're good.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Thanks for attending. I'm Amy Weldon, coming to you today from Decorah, Iowa, where I have the good fortune of being an English professor at Luther College. I'm assuming some knowledge of John Keats here. If you're not so familiar with John Keats, you can read more about Keats and about my work on him at amyweldon.com. So my paper is called Wings in the Abyss, Reading Keats in the Pandemic. Teaching Keats in a pandemic is just too real. Maybe that's why we love him. Maybe that's why we need him. In his time and ours, the world never stops turning upside down, and what we hope may be at least something like right side up again. Our work as professors is to help students thrive in this turning world by reading it with intelligence. And in this effort, Keats's own short, tumbling life and the images he uses to navigate and narrate it are guides and companions, indeed, a possession for all time. Let's focus on one famous letter written by Keats to his friend John Hamilton Reynolds, May the 3rd, 1818. The difference of high sensations with and without knowledge, writes Keats, appears to me this. In the latter case, we are falling continually 10,000 fathoms deep and being blown up again without wings and with all the horror of a bare-shouldered creature. In the former case, our shoulders are fledged and we go through the same air and space without fear, end quote. Students are quick to recognize their own emotional states here, journeying, discerning, trying to find a way forward. And in that Milton-esque depiction of spinning free fall, they recognize their own anxiety. They recognize the kind of existential doubt they feel, struggling to navigate a world that only looks full of options, having been robbed of late adolescent milestones and normal college and secure careers. I feel as if corporations have stripped all the copper wire out of the house, said one recent graduate to me, and we're just trying to turn on the lights. What stops the fall? What turns the flailing body, mind, soul right side up? Knowledge. Yet what exactly does that word mean? This year, Keats's spinning body strikes multiple objects in midair, including us. On January 6th, as I was teaching my Romanticism course entitled, of course, Romanticism for a World Upside Down, I listened to the Capitol insurrection unfold on my car radio as a nurse leaned through my window and stuck a swab up my nose. On January 8th, I tested positive for COVID-19. And on January 7th, I zoomed in from my dining room to talk with my Romanticism students about what, serendipitously, I had already assigned. Keats's letters and a selection of his major odes, alongside Hari Kunzru's excellent essay, Complexity, from the January 2021 issue of Harper's Magazine. In analyzing the appeal of QAnon, Kunzru compares it to that familiar romantic realm, the sublime. Despite its incoherence, he writes, there is, in a strictly aesthetic sense, something sublime about it, meaning QAnon, or at least about the experience it is trying to represent, the experience of scale and complexity of a world that is beyond the capacity of the human mind to apprehend, end quote. When we are struggling in what Keats calls in this same letter, the burden of the mystery, more about that in a moment, we seek easy answers, whether from conspiracy theorists or tech bros offering what Kunzru also condemns as too easy models of simplicity. The real world is messy, so the more you know in more different directions, the more routes of investigation and information you send out into the soil of reality as it is, the better off you'll be, no matter what winds begin to blow. In this same letter, Keats tells Reynolds that although he's left the practice of medicine for poetry, he's keeping his medical books. Quote, every department of knowledge we see excellent and calculated towards a great whole. I am so convinced of this that I am glad at not having given away my medical books, which I shall again look over to keep alive the little I know thitherwards, end quote. He's even going to pick the brain of Reynolds, an aspiring lawyer and their mutual friend. And moreover, he continues, I intend through you and Rice to become a sort of PIP civilian. That's PIP-civilian, which is not a term I have ever heard anywhere else other than Keats's letters. As far as I can tell, an OED consultation yielded only a little information. As far as I can tell, this means a kind of embryo lawyer, a self-aware dilettante, someone who knows a little about law and therefore enjoys teasing the real lawyers and himself. An extensive knowledge, Keats says, is needful to thinking people. It takes away the heat and fever and helps, by widening speculation, to ease the burden of the mystery, end quote. By widening speculation, potentially this can bring on the terror of the void, the flailing groundlessness of uncertainty, the sophomore stuck in her developmentally appropriate but still terrifying relativist phase, the nihilistic gloom of the broken gate in Akira Kurosawa's great film Rashomon. Keats thinks about intellectual and spiritual development in this letter too. I'll quote here a passage at length. He compares, quote, human life to a large mansion of many apartments, two of which I can only describe, the doors of the rest being as yet shut upon me. The first we step into we call the infant or thoughtless chamber, in which we remain as long as we do not think. We remain there a long while, longer for some than others, one suspects, and notwithstanding the doors of the second chamber remain wide open, showing a bright appearance, we care not to hasten to it, but are at length imperceptibly impelled by the awakening of the thinking principle within us. We no sooner get into the second chamber, which I shall call the chamber of maiden thought, than we become intoxicated with the light in the atmosphere. We see nothing but pleasant wonders and think of delaying there forever in delight. However, among the effects this breathing is father of is that tremendous one of sharpening one's vision into the heart and nature of man, of convincing one's nerves that the world is full of misery and heartbreak, pain, sickness, and oppression, whereby this chamber of maiden thought becomes gradually darkened, and at the same time, on all sides of it, many doors are set open, but all dark, all leading to dark passages. We see not the balance of good and evil. We are in a mist. We are now in that state. We feel the burden of the mystery, end quote. This is a man who knew mysteries and burdens, as well as he knew the antecedents of this marvelous passage. Shakespeare's 7 ages of man, the developmental stages of the brain itself, the year-wise progression through school that we and our students also know. At this time, he was nursing his dying brother, Tom, realizing that the family illness consumption was coming fatally upon him too. He was a doctor. He knew the signs. Yet as heartbreaking as seeing clearly can be, it convinces one's nerves that the world is full of misery. It also sharpens one's vision into the heart and nature of man. As the future doctors in my medicine and literature course are wrestling with right now, you have to be compassionate to feel along with someone else's suffering. But you also have to be able to look clearly, control yourself, close the wound, stop the blood. Sometimes you won't have all the right answers, and you'll have to be okay with that. 6 months earlier, in December 1817, Keats had scribbled in a letter to his brothers his famous definition of negative capability. At once it struck me, he wrote, what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature in which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean, negative capability. That is, when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason, end quote. Such an artist, Keats writes, is guided less by logic or plans than by beauty. With a great poet, he writes, the sense of beauty overcomes every other consideration, or rather, obliterates all consideration. Knowledge can bring us to a close-up view on the intricacies of our own nervous systems, of our own body's progression through disease. It can be the interdisciplinary reach and lift that the liberal arts at their best make possible, the feathers that sprout from our students' shoulders as they spin through uncharted space, the wings that arrest the fall of loneliness and fear, when they are able to connect Keats with neuroscience and their own sick parents' struggles, the lift and bearing up that comes when they look into the page and see their world and know they are not alone. In beauty, there is a saving thing, a grounding and a dreaming thing at once, an enduring thing. And for students and me, reading Keats in the pandemic, it was a guiding thing. Keats's works and his tragically short life, he was dead before his 25th birthday, asks each of us a version of Mary Oliver's poetic cry. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? With great artists like Keats at their side, students lift themselves up with the companionship of other lives, other visions, other stories, other attempts to see clear and hold true throughout time. In discussion the day after the Capitol riot, students seized on Keats's letters and poems and his life and turned them over and over again and held them close. It is my dearest hope that they will feel the presence of those wings sprouting from their shoulders, the knowledge and insight that, coming to their aid, arrests their fall. And then, in Keats's words, they may go through even our ever more uncertain world without fear. Thank you.
Well, we are obviously glad that even though you tested positive, you seem to be healthy now.
Good, thank you.
I have good news and bad news for us. The bad news is, for whatever reason, we haven't been able to contact Gregory Smith, but we've tried. The good news is that means that so long as I stay under 15 minutes, we'll have more time for common discussion. So let me start. My talk is Liberal Education and Leadership, Tocqueville, Clausewitz, and Thucydides, that puts a more practical spin on my approach to cortex and curricula than we've seen so far. I was present almost at the creation of ACTC more than 20 years ago when I worked for a foundation devoted to liberty and liberal education. but I later took a position at the United States Naval War College, where I work in the professional education of mid-career and senior military officers. I'm really happy to be back to ACTC. After 20 years, I feel like Odysseus coming home from the Trojan War. Many were my sufferings and my adventures in thinking about core texts and courses in the context of professional military education, which has been a kind of remedial liberal education for future leaders. I'm going to set Circe and Calypso aside and tell you about one of those adventures. It began by thinking about what Alexa de Tocqueville called democratic history in Democracy in America. In democratic ages, the French aristocrat, in democratic ages, the French aristocrat noted, historians tend to associate the causes of historical phenomena with abstract impersonal forces like the economy or society or whatever other systemic constraints they have in mind. In contrast, in aristocratic ages, historians tend to ascribe historical causation to the decisions of leaders like Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great. Both sides are right, by the way. In democratic ages, understood as those with an increasing equality of conditions, individuals do matter less and systems more. But historians in both ages tended to flatter those in charge. It is flattering for aristocrats to learn just how important they are. And democratic history, which often debunks the great man theory of history, flatters common men and women too, by reducing us all to a general level of influence that is insignificance. Tocqueville feared that in making us all creatures of forces beyond our control, democratic history might breed fatalism. Nothing we can do to change the system, better just to try to ride it out. Or so we often hear from millions of Americans who decide not to vote. Fatalism might undermine citizenship by encouraging what Tocqueville called individualism. And he did not mean rugged individualism. He meant a habit of retreating quietly into home and hearth that would make us all fit tools of tyrants who need to divide their enemies in order to conquer them. One remedy for this danger for Tocqueville was for those who live in democratic ages to read ancient sources, perhaps ancient history especially, because it emphatically does show that individuals, acting as citizens or leaders, can influence the course of history. Freedom in a modern democratic age, he seemed to think, appears to require a little aristocratic leavening. Perhaps more unconsciously than not, my institution, the United States Naval War College, follows Tocqueville's advice scrupulously. That is because our students are military leaders, that is to say, decision makers, perhaps the closest thing to aristocrats in a democratic age. When the going gets rough, you don't want officers who say there is nothing they can do. Granted, we all face constraints, but you want leaders who think through the entire range of options available and pick the best. Officers at war colleges around the world learn to practice a kind of aristocratic history, not from Tocqueville, but from Karl von Clausewitz especially. Please note he was a faun, thus he was an aristocrat. He was also a Prussian colonel who fought in the Napoleonic Wars and later taught at the world's first war college, the Kriegsakademie, which was founded in 1806 after the Prussians had suffered another devastating defeat at the hands of Napoleon, whom Clausewitz called the god of war himself. How could mere mortals fight against a god? Part of Clausewitz's answer is called critical analysis, a disciplined way of thinking about the relation amongst ends, ways, and means. In On War, he introduced the discipline in the context of explaining to his students, all decorated veterans likely to become senior officers, why they needed to study history, military history especially, even and most especially ancient military history. This was a tough sell for the Prussian colonel. For these veterans of recent combat, it looked absurd to study wars when soldiers fought with swords and spears and navies consisted of rowboats with sails. Technology, gunpowder especially, had transformed war. So Clausewitz had to persuade them that some things never or rarely change, that war is always an act of violence to compel your enemy to do your will. If so, then the ancient past is no less relevant than the present. Indeed, it may not even be the past. It might be the future. One can look, therefore, at historical cases to evaluate the decisions of past commanders for the sake of honing strategic judgment of commanders in the present. Now, our word critical comes from an ancient Greek word that means to choose or judge. Properly understood, critical analysis is about the education of judgment, which ironically cannot be taught so much as cultivated amongst those who have already displayed good judgment. As Clausewitz explains the discipline, critical analysis is not an evaluation of decision, not merely an evaluation of decisions actually made, but of all possible decisions, which requires imagination. Napoleon did not have to invade Russia. What if he had focused on building a new navy to challenge England at sea instead? Might France have won the Napoleonic Wars? Might the English be speaking French today? The problem with imagination, of course, is that it sometimes runs wild. For Clausewitz, the mind of the commander had to be disciplined to focus on realistic options. Yes, Napoleon might have won had he possessed B-52 bombers, but if wishes were horses, beggars would ride. So commanders had to look for options that were feasible, in which rewards outweighed risks and benefits exceeded costs. They had to be disciplined to anticipate how an adversary might react to any alternative strategies they proposed. Above all, they had to be disciplined to understand war as a means to accomplish an end, what Clausewitz called policy, the interests of the state. All strategies that did not serve policy were bad strategies by definition. Clausewitz was the ultimate professional disciplinarian, not because he was Prussian or autocratic, but because he understood that intellectual discipline was the best hope Prussia had to defeat Napoleon and his successors. So around the world, officers at war colleges practiced critical analysis so that they might become better military leaders. Some cases are better suited than others for practicing critical analysis, however. Perhaps none is better than the Peloponnesian War, which Thucydides recorded more than 2,500 years ago. Thucydides saw that war as a microcosm of all war. If you understand that war, you will understand something that persists through all war. That is why he called his account a possession for all time. Officers coming home from Vietnam and Iraq made an immediate and personal connection with Thucydides, especially his account of the Athenian expedition to Sicily, which leads me to say a few words about pedagogy, which used to be a very important subject at ACTC. I'm not sure whether it's still there. That is, how one might use Thucydides to practice critical analysis and cultivate the judgment of undergraduates who are ambitious to lead today. You might ask students, was the Athenian expedition to Sicily good strategy poorly executed, or just plain bad strategy? The question requires them to think about leadership from different perspectives. When things go wrong, as they did for Athens and Sicily, and America and Vietnam and Iraq, is that because the leaders chose a bad strategy in the first place, or because the leaders failed to execute a sound one properly? And how could we know? Well, one might assign students to two different debate teams. Let one team make the case that the expedition was just plain bad strategy, and therefore ought not ever to have been attempted. Let the other make the case that it really was good strategy, but commanders in the field, Nicias especially, bungled the execution. I suspect the conversation you would hear might sound something like this. The critics are going to say the expedition was terrible strategy because it distracted Athens from its primary rival, Sparta. The expedition was founded on false intelligence that Augusta would pay for it. And since a sucker is born every day, the Athenians were hoping the expedition would be cost and risk-free. As one might learn from the Melian dialogue, however, hope is not a strategy. The expedition exposed Athens to the dangers of a two-front war in Sicily and Attica. And even if Athens had won at Syracuse, how could it hold the city, much less exert its power throughout Sicily? Would the cost of holding Sicily have exceeded the cost of the war in the first place? Now, the other team might well respond that the expedition was actually good strategy, but poorly executed. Syracuse, after all, appeared on the verge of dominating all of Sicily. As a colony of Corinth, it might have sided with Corinth and Sparta against Athens, thus tilting the balance of power at sea, especially irreversibly against Athens. It made some sense, as Alcibiades suggested, to knock out Sicily first, then turn on Carthage or Italy or both, and then defeat Sparta after accumulating the resources of the Western Mediterranean. However, Nicias consistently fumbled as a field commander. He failed, for example, to use his superior navy to intercept reinforcements for Syracuse from Sparta and Corinth. And get this, Syracuse was about to surrender. By not interdicting those reinforcements, he gave Syracuse the will to continue. Above all, he refused to order evacuation until it was too late, thus leading to the complete destruction of the expedition. The fault, you could argue, was not in the stars or in the strategy, but in the field commander, Nicias himself. At a certain point, you might want to cough loudly. Then ask a simple question students often forget to ask. What precisely was Athens trying to accomplish in Sicily? What was its political goal? Political objectives, after all, are the standards by which strategies must be measured. To talk about strategies independent of the objectives is about like talking about means independent of the ends. It makes no sense. Did the Athenians just want allies in Sicily? Or did they want to conquer the entire island, which was bigger than Attica and the Peloponnesus combined? Were their objectives so big as to be infeasible? Or were their goals actually more modest? Conquer Syracuse and tilt the balance of power in Sicily in Athens' favor. If so, maybe, just maybe, the expedition was within the limits of the practically possible. Now cough again. Ask another simple question, which goes to the heart of critical analysis. Did the Athenians have better options than going to Sicily? If the answer is yes, then there is a strong case that the Sicilian expedition was a bad strategy. One can stipulate that Nicias was a terrible field commander, at least for this expedition, but examine his arguments against going to Sicily before the expedition. Amphipolis in northern Greece was still in rebellion. Did it not make more sense to shore up Athens' existing empire before seeking to expand it? And remember the immortal words of John Lennon. Imagine, what if the Athenians had opted to shore up the peace of Nicias? Maybe the fundamental flaw in their strategy was, as we used to say in the 1960s, they did not give peace a chance. Maybe. Obviously, leadership involves more than good judgment. Character matters too, which is just one very good reason why the Athenians turned on Alcibiades. Nonetheless, leaders who fail to consider all possible options may ignore the practical ones and become obsessed with utopian, reckless, costly, and self-destructive ones. Now, it is common today to dismiss liberal education as suited for the ivory tower only. Indeed, in a sense, I think Jose made the argument praising it for precisely that. This, however, is not how most mid-career and senior professional military officers view their contact with Clausewitz and Thucydides. For them, these authors supply the most realistic ways of learning about war and leadership short of actual combat itself. They cannot afford to be fatalists. They need to consider all possible courses of action and determine the best. So ironically, it is the ivory tower that is responsible for this time-tested approach of war colleges today. With a little imagination, critical analysis can be applied to cultivating leaders in peace. Let me say that again, leaders in peace as well as war, because we all have to consider the options and evaluate the best. It might even save us from the fatalism Tocqueville feared might make us tools of tyrants today. All right, that's the end of my remarks. My suggestion, since we have an eclectic group of papers, but an official title is, why don't we spend a few minutes amongst ourselves, the panel members, talking about what it means to be a possession for all time. And then we can open up, well, we'll go in any direction, but we'll open up for the audience. So would anyone want to talk about what it means to be a possession for all time? Somebody's going to have to unmute.
Sure. I mean, I think that I don't know if we don't want to jump into the presentations yet, but I would ask, or start with a question: why would we need possessions for all time in order to gain something like critical analysis? Couldn't critical analysis be gained if you, say, study the latest conflict and the decisions that some commander made in the war, or even go to World War I? Like, why couldn't you look at some of the decisions made on the Somme, or in some of the expeditions into Turkey, and look at and develop critical analysis based on that? Why do we need these possessions for all time in order to attain critical analysis to begin with? In fact, isn't it more burdensome in a way, because you need to familiarize students with foreign scene in a time that's way far removed from our own, in in cultures that we can barely understand, in a language that the students probably don't understand. Like what's the point of reading Thucydides to begin with?
Okay. When
I'm playing
he,
devil's advocate. I mean,
sure. One part of what you said is easy to answer. The other part is not so hard. Thucydides is just our first case study. We go through about 30, starting with the Peloponnesian War and we end with the possibility of conflict with China. And so, yeah, all the cases you mentioned, we studied. Why do we do that? Well, the answer is, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. We practice critical analysis on different cases. But when it comes to why Thucydides in particular, he makes the claim that he's not writing for the applause of the moment, either like a sophist giving a speech or a poet. And there's a little bit of a jab at Homer. But rather, he's writing for those who seek to understand. Because what happens in this war, he says, will happen more or less again and again and again, so long as human nature remains the same. What is really interesting about that passage, which is at book 1, paragraph 23, is it's really saying that this book is valuable for its own sake, simply for the sake of understanding the human condition, which gets revealed through the kind of portrait of human nature that comes out in the book. When Thucydides says this, he never makes a single claim about the practical utility of the book. That's an unintended consequence, because you can practice critical analysis on it, but I think Thucydides saw his book as his encounter with eternity. But others should jump in now. Mike or Amy?
Yeah, so I guess a follow-up question to what you said, Dr. Walling, and then another comment. If Thucydides thinks that he's, Thucydides is not my area of expertise, but I think that there's something to be said for a book that reveals human nature and the human condition. You could say it's good for its own sake in a way, but I think knowledge of the human condition is utterly and totally practical for a whole host of perspectives. So maybe that's something, it is good for its own sake. Actually, I think a useful way of maybe getting at that question is a breakdown of the good as articulated by Thomas Hobbes, where he talks about there's 3 kinds of good things, one of which is good in the effect, which we might call good for itself. The effect of Thucydides, the reading of the book and the pleasure one could derive, or the enjoyment one can derive of reading it, is good. But there's also good for what it does. We might also look to the Republic, where Glaucon asks Socrates, is justice good for its own sake, good for its consequences, or good for both? And we might say it's good for both. We can have the stubborn Glaucon in our midst who's going to say, well, show me why it's just good for itself. But I think that's going to be difficult. But actually, to a point you made, Locke writes a letter, I guess, about a short essay on the reading suggestions for gentlemen. And he makes a distinction between reading that should be done for understanding the original or the foundation for government and for governance. And as a suggestion for the originals of government, the foundations of political right, he unabashedly points to his own book, which was published synonymously. So that was, giving himself a plug. But when he says, more importantly, when he talks about governance, he says, read history. And I think that that may actually get at your question, what is a possession for all time? And something you had already mentioned. If human nature is the same and reality operates in the way that we expect it to, in that there are consequences to actions, and those consequences can be more or less known based on historical reflection, then something like a possession for all time would be a real understanding of the way reality operates.
All right, fair enough. I'm going to withhold responding because I want to give Amy a chance to join us.
Oh.
You're muted. You're muted.
Oh,
There you go.
okay, sorry. All of this for me sends me back to I'm writing about this in a forthcoming book, but I think very often and very deeply about what I consider to be my ultimate strategic goal and purpose as a college professor in the 21st century, which is to increase students' capacities. That is a word that has become valuable to me to walk with and live with and think about and talk with students about for so many reasons. What I found myself thinking of as I was pondering y'all's remarks was something that's valuable but endangered, I think, beyond core text focused courses so often, is a vision offered to students of your little self in its present moment as a conversation partner with all of these other selves across time and space. This is where I think we can get into genuine encounters with difference, genuine encounters with strangeness, in the multiple romantic, senses of that word, and an expansion of the self and a concept of the self's dignity that I think is worth speaking for. Going back to Keats as an example, I try to take everything back to Keats as much as possible. He sees him as the son of a stable owner in London, working class kid at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century in London, mocked by Byron and to some degree Shelley and their reviewers and publishers for being just some cockney who thinks he can write, who doesn't know Greek. Isn't he, ha ha, isn't he ridiculous? Back to the shop, Mr. John, back to your pills and plasters is what some reviewers literally told him. But Keats sees himself as a conversation partner with Shakespeare, Milton, Chaucer, Spencer, and in Chapman's translation, which he very famously writes about, Homer, which is something that opens up this world to him. When I teach Keats, therefore, I talk with students. A little bit is all it takes just to point out to students that here is someone who just by reading and by engaging in this conversation offers a very gentle and a very firm rebuke to everything in his world that says, you can't. This is not for you. Who do you think you are? Keats says, I too belong in this conversation that has included so many people before me and will include so many people after me. As we think about the 21st century, at least as I think about it, when so many things about electronic media in particular are, as I see them, trying to reduce the self to one of those fungible units, like let's sell one of those pictures on the wall of a gallery for Bitcoin. What are those things? The BFIs or whatever they are? I don't even know. I read about them, scoffed, and turned to the next page. When the self is becoming just some sort of monetizable, fungible, internet sellable influencing unit, the liberal arts, as I see it, is one of the last places where students can hear your personhood and its capacity to think and feel and be turned toward a form of the good is real and matters. That's what it's about for me, the work that we're doing and what we're about and why we read texts from a wider span of time than simply what students think they know right now. It's work that I personally am extremely privileged to be a part of and try to get better at every day.
I get it. The expansion of humanity by participating in what I think Newman called the Great Conversation. Let me pick up on something Mike said, and then maybe well, we can figure out what we want to do next. You're right. Things can be valuable in their own sake for simply in what at one level, that's what Thucydides says. You're just going to expand your understanding of what it means to be a human being through the understanding of this war. On the other hand, it can be valuable for practical and pragmatic purposes. I have a piece out that Charlie edited, Charlotte Thomas, on political science and political medicine.
Mhm.
The scientific part is understanding for its own sake, but Thucydides' account is riddled with allusions to Greek medicine. Here's the bad news. He thought he had described the eternal condition of humanity. But along comes Thomas Hobbes, and he says, I think improvement is possible. I think we can use science to come to the relief of the human estate. And so there's something more hopeful about the practical uses of Thucydides' work than was in Thucydides himself in the early Enlightenment. With that, I'm going to stop. Do we wish to continue this or invite everybody who's watching to jump in?
I'd like to hear from others who are here.
I agree.
All right, the floor is open. You can use the hand raise feature. You can also turn on your video and wave, and I'll recognize you so you can come in. Patience.
Prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. We need to revise that for the Zoom era, perhaps.
Perhaps so. All right, the floor remains open. Anyone from the audience who wishes to jump in, do so at any time. Jose, you raised, and you're playing a kind of devil's advocate.
Sure. I have more to say on that if you want, but I can...
Well, we're just brainstorming here now. All we need is a pizza.
Sure. I mean, so I think that, well, and Mike also touched on this. What does it mean to pursue something for its own sake? That's something I tried to get at in my paper. And in the end, I mean, when you start looking at it from a strictly human perspective, you're always looking at it, you always end up with the human good. From Newman's perspective, that's clear. You always end up as the acquisition of knowledge as something that is good for man in itself, not for some practical purpose, but for his own benefit. Which, I mean, once you reduce it down to that, you end up with a practical end. I mean, human good is the ultimate practical end. Schelling tried to step away from that by actually going at some sort of good beyond the human by attributing it to the divine. And once you do that, you eliminate any sort of attachment to reality in itself, and you just go to the a priori substance. And I mean, and I don't know how useful that is from the perspective of education in itself. So I'm kind of on Newman's side. Maybe we're kind of all agreeing on the same thing. I don't think there's that much opposition between, looking for knowledge for its own sake from this anthropologic perspective, and saying that it's good for things like developing critical analysis, helping students to develop different skills or capacities. I would say that to throw another wrench into this whole thing, Dr. Whalen, you talked about creating an aristocracy through liberal education, and that's something I'm interested in pushing you on. Do you think that a liberal education tries to create, say, an aristocracy within our democratic society, that it's something for some people who have the, say, capacity for this deep critical thinking, or is it something that is accessible to everyone?
Well, my answer to that is I don't know. I wanted to see if I could link some of the things that you said with those that Amy said, because she's coming to us from the realm of literature. Was it Keats who said, truth is beauty and beauty is truth? That is all you know and all you need know. It seems to me that Keats puts a heavy emphasis on the aesthetic side of the human good. But it's interesting, truth and beauty. Is there, this is getting kind of heavy, and I feel like I'm going into Plato land, which I haven't visited in 20 years. But I'm just wondering whether the unity that we've been speaking about requires that truth be beautiful and that the beautiful be truthful. I'm just raising the question. Go ahead, Amy.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you brought that up, because when we read that great poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn, you are remembering those lines correctly. That's very, very good. But the thing that's interesting to do with the students is that we end up, there's an audience participation component to that, which is that we sort of ask for volunteer to pretend to be Keats in the museum with the Grecian urn, because the syntax of the poem and the structure of the poem literally mimics someone in a museum. If you can imagine it, the urn is on the pedestal as Keats went to see the British Museum, and the Elgin marbles, quote unquote, which are still there, the Parthenon friezes. Someone circling this object.
It's on my tie.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you. Someone circling this object, peppering it with questions in an attempt to use the questing mind to get below the surface of the beautiful thing into a story, and to grapple with the limits of what can and cannot be known or understood for sure. The instinct for beauty says to us, there's something here that compels me to keep looking at the object, that compels me to stay with it, that compels me to circle around and around and around, peppering it with question. Who are these people? Where are these villagers going, leading that heifer to the sacrifice? What's going on here? Why are this little town, why are there no people? And then the last lines, Keats literally ventriloquizes the urn itself. And he says, let's see what are the lines. He says, thou shalt remain in midst of greater woe than ours, a friend to man to whom thou sayest, quote, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know. And students, every time we read the poem aloud, the students stop and they have this look of great perplexity on their faces. And you know, you can tease them a little bit and say, so there's your answer. Any questions? Any questions? And students say, I have all the questions in the world. This is and is not the answer. What is it? So I love the way that beauty is the end point, is the goal. That's it. That's all you need. Okay, nothing to see here. We're done. And also the prompt to the continual questions, which is, again, as we're thinking at my school right now and in my students' lives, they're very, very much bound up in question of career and where will I go and what is next for me. And we're talking something that is seeming to help them as career or adulthood is not a place you achieve once and for all and then you're finished, right? There's a series of steps. You get here, you get here, you get here. Sometimes you go back to here in order to go up here. So the ability, I think, that Keats describes and that our texts enact to be in the questioning, to be with it, to keep using the question as a means of forward progression is another one of those intellectual skills and psychological and even moral skills that I think we're hoping to foster. Thank you for quoting the poem. That was awesome.
Well, I was just wondering, what if the truth were ugly? What's the, what's the incentive to seek the truth if it's ugly? The horror. I don't know.
Yeah.
So you're pointing to, I don't know, the need to pursue something that is objective in the pursuit of beauty, or at least, yeah. It's not just pursuit of one's own beauty or what someone views as beauty, but there is some sort of beauty that can be viewed as truly beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, we keep circling around Plato here.
Right. Right.
Well, Plato seemed to have an answer to that. I mean,
Plato, of course, says don't trust the poets, which is always funny.
Except then Plato is a poet himself.
That's the paradox.
and works to bring in the poets as much as possible towards the end of the Republic.
The poets are good when I write their poetry for them.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right.
Hey, members of the audience, would anybody care to jump in? Give me a chance. Jose, I didn't want to sound like someone dividing the world into gold, silver, and bronze souls. That's not my style. And I certainly don't tell myths about it. It does seem to me, in some ways, Machiavelli is good at this, that there are different ways of looking at history. And it's linked in part to what Michael was saying about governance, which I'm going to treat temporarily as synonymous with leadership. That you can study history, and many do today, in a democratic way, where you focus on, in what Tocqueville called a democratic way, in which you focus on abstract causes. I mean, the giant of democratic history giants are Karl Marx and Leo Tolstoy. For Marx, all that stuff, all that political stuff, that superstructure, the real thing is the system, the economic system. And Tolstoy, of course, is debunking the great man theory of history in War and Peace. All right, I got that. We are all creatures of things that some of which we cannot control at all, some of which we can only control partially. At the same time, and it's partly just the mission of my institution. These guys got to make decisions, and we want them to make good decisions. And well, how do you teach leaders to lead? Well, in part by giving them examples of good, bad, and flawed leadership that they can study over and over and over again and ruminate about. It's not rocket science, it's actually harder. But I saw, well, Clausewitz actually said that. There are certain, there are aspects of education. I'll put it this way: Aristotle's distinction between theoretical and practical wisdom. I'm in the business of helping people acquire practical wisdom, using authors, however, who thought that they had risen to the eternal. And I find that extremely paradoxical. I haven't fully figured it out, but I do think that figures like Clausewitz and Thucydides, both of whom seem to think that they have understood the nature of war, and through war come to understand human nature itself, have that paradoxical quality of helping us understand for its own sake, but also for the sake of being useful citizens and leaders. We got somebody speaking. Oh, we got somebody coming in. Jamie Crow.
Jamie Croverty. Thank you. Thank you. I think my question sort of directed at Amy, and that is what you would say with respect to the characteristics of the students that I encountered before I retired, and we often talked a bit about this, is something that Eva Brand said in her book called Paradoxes of Education in a Republic, that Republican education properly ought to be an inquiry into ends. And what I see here is we've taken for granted in some sense that the students have made some sort of decision. And I would say in Professor Walling's case, these are men of action. They've chosen to pursue virtue and happiness through a life of action. And I think, though I don't admit to having understood Jose's talk quite as well, it seems to me that contemplation is the end point. So in the Aristotelian dichotomy between those choices, which is preferable. But what I found is, of course, that most of the students that I encounter are simply back in that unenlightened state that Aristotle talks about, where all they're concerned about is the pursuit of means, in particular wealth, and not necessarily a large amount of wealth, but their preoccupation is with how am I going to get a job and get enough to have the life I want. But then if you ask them, well, what sort of life do you want? It all ends up being back to the same things.
Yeah.
And I don't know quite how you initiate, that discussion or begin to make the choices that are there clear, and the difference even between those things. What do you find, as you've talked most about how you interact with your students?
Yeah. Thank you very much for asking the question. I'll begin by saying that much as its name indicates, Luther College is a college of the Lutheran Church. There's several like us. We have students of many faiths and no faith at all, but we're founded pretty deeply in something that has come to mean a very great deal to me since in the 16 years that I've been here, and that I've come to find is a really wonderful tool of pedagogy as well, which is the Lutheran ideal of vocation. It's very, very deep in Lutheran theology. To Martin Luther himself, it meant a very specific thing, but it is part of our sort of way of being here as faculty members, as a very teaching centered, which I think is true of probably all of our institutions, very teaching centered undergraduate institution, very, 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 very mentoring centered institution. I follow the idea of vocation into the process of helping the student ask the questions that will help them discern, what am I being called to do in order to serve the world first, and in order to become and discover the best things in me that are here to offer the world. What this means for us in practicality is that we have many, many students coming here who, like a lot of college students in America now, are being told, I should go to college so I can get a job, so I can grasp at the ever vanishing, and I do believe it is an ever vanishing American dream and prospect of security, right? But what does it mean? Go to college, get a degree, but why? In my first year course, I have very particular ways of introducing students to the fact that those questions even are questions, because many students might not have ever heard, say, family members or friends or other people even sort of tell them that that's an option, you know? We talk quite a lot about that. With every text, I take a pretty specific side route kind of back to this question. But at our college, meaning and who will you be and what is your purpose on earth are on the table, not in an explicitly Christian Lutheran context in every way, but they're on the table in every aspect of our curriculum and our co-curriculum here at Luther. And as faculty members, I think we have some latitude to ponder how, from within our own discipline, we may bring students to be able to see, or rather platonically, turn them towards a vision of those possibilities. I hope that answers your question.
Can I address Jamie's question from a slightly different perspective? Look, I'm a frustrated liberal artist, but I needed a job to send my kids to college, and I wound up working for the government. In the evenings, however, I did teach a great books program at the local community college, pro bono, and that was simply to fill my soul. That was what it was about primarily. What was interesting about it is most of the students were over 65 years old. Given the economic forces students in general face, but I would say especially in the heavily underserved Hispanic community that I was connected with in Monterey, of course, they're going to think about education initially, primarily in terms of getting and spending. How could it be otherwise, given that situation? Now, you can turn on a few light bulbs, and you never know how and when it's going to happen, but it can happen. It's like people turning towards the good in Plato's cave. It happens. But what amazed me was how many people had gone out and made a whole lot of money and retired and said, what is the most meaningful, useful thing I can do in my life? And they decided to participate in this Great Books program. And that's interesting because I think normally we think of liberal education as something for the young.
Yeah.
But times have changed. And I think it is increasingly becoming something for the older because of the holes in their soul that have arisen as they've gone through life. Mike.
Yeah, building on that, it might actually be, saying that times have changed. Maybe times have gone back. I mean, isn't it Plato in the Republic who's talking about the philosophic education isn't for the young person? I think in a certain way we have it backwards. We try to. There's a whole host of things that at least now, not to say that the liberal education as it's instituted in different places today is what he's talking about by teaching in dialectic or anything like that. But analogously, we try to teach students high truths, which is good and beautiful. But I mean, in my own experience at a liberal arts undergraduate institution, studying questions kind of like you brought up, Jamie, about the good life from Aristotle, the good of contemplation. So I'm married and I have 2 children and one on the way, and that doesn't help me coming out of college. So it almost seems like we sort of get it backwards. You talked about Republican education. It has part of what that is, I think, is an education toward to put it in political terms, your regime. We don't really, we have a strange way of educating toward our regime. And I think that is sort of indicative of the fact that we don't really know what our regime is at this point. We seem to, like you said, we have an education that's largely focused on getting people jobs so that they can find a way to make money. But it doesn't teach them how to do practical things that'll help them in their everyday life. It teaches them things that are maybe intimately related or maybe analogously. I think there's important things to actually think. The study of literature, as you brought up, Amy, is particularly helpful in helping students come to that understanding of their own capacities and give themselves a sense of self in light of all the turmoil. But there's a practical side too that I don't think education gets at. Not to say that understanding of the sense of self isn't practical, but I think there are practicalities that education doesn't prepare students for. At least that was my experience.
Yeah, just speaking to that quickly, I will say, and I tell my students about this quite a lot, I try to kind of leaven and intercut the big ideas and sort of here's the good of your soul, here's the beginning of the path that can lead into the future, and the texts that will walk with you along that path your whole life, and you may return to them after retirement, and see the following things. I try to always intercut that with, here is an example of something an employer told me, about what they need students to be able to do. We have a program at Luther called the Rochester Semester because we're an hour and a half south of Rochester, Minnesota, home of the Mayo Clinic. It's a new program. We've just built it up. Students go, they stay in Rochester, work in internships in the community and connected with Mayo, all sorts of things. The faculty supervisor colleague in that program told us 3 things that I've written on a Post-it note and stuck on my filing cabinet. She says, these are the 3 things employers and internship providers tell us that they are looking for the most. These are the 3. 1, intrinsic motivation. 2, capacity to learn. 3, unabashed curiosity. I share those with students very deeply, and I tell them my own experience in the corporate world. I was in advertising and PR before I went to graduate school, way back in the dawn when the Earth's crust was cooling, before the internet walked the earth. This was the late 1990s. My boss said she gave me a particularly prestigious and difficult writing job for a really big client. And and I said, basically, why not the other copywriter, the senior person in the shop? And she said, because you're the English major. And that was kind of all she said, like, you're the English major. You're the creative person. You've got the flair, you've got the range, you've got, in the words I use with my students, capacities. So I agree with you, Mike, completely. If you don't always keep an eye on the parents sort of wondering, like, how is it going to, you know, if you don't keep an eye on, like, so what is the goal? What is the strategy? What's the point? You will drift up into 30,000 feet and be lost. But I think as long as you can intercut the two, you can both inspire and help the student feel like they have a way to move forward.
That's good.
Sure. I'd like to jump in here a little bit. I think for, and I've taught a fair amount too. I think that when you have students who are always looking towards the practical end, they will never learn to appreciate what they can find in great books. I think it's, in order to teach great books well, because they are complex, they require a whole host of efforts, not just from an individual, but from a community. They require a lot of someone to guide you through these texts. They require multiple readings. You're not going to get that type of perseverance with a student who's just looking for some goal that is beyond the text. So I think that for liberal education to survive, we need to inculcate a habit. And I think this is what Newman was getting at when he talks about habit, as the end of a liberal education. It's inculcating the intellectual habit of pursuing knowledge for its own sake, of looking to looking to the good of contemplation as something that is valuable in itself, regardless of the myriad of goods that you can get through study, through intellectual formation. And obviously, when you go into the corporate world or whatever, when you go to look for a job, when you're done with those 4 years of undergrad, there's a ton that you can gain through the study that is going to be very applicable. But if in those 4 years, I think if professors are constantly calling your attention back to that practicality, it kind of distracts from the essence of what you're trying to inculcate in the students. So I really think that the looking to the practical first has in part led to the death of many liberal arts institutions. When you start introducing, we need a nursing school and we'll keep our core here, but we need the moneymaker. We need the internships that places students at this particular place, and that is put at the forefront of what your institution does. Then you start losing that liberal character.
I think that's a fair point. Jamie brought up the notion of education in the Republic being primarily about ends, according to Eva Braun. I think there's a lot to be said for that. And I'm going to try to link that insight with something that Amy brought up about the notion of a vocation. The German word for that is Beruf. It seems to me that the idea of a vocation could serve as a kind of halfway house toward learning for its own sake. What is my particular calling? Yeah, I know there's a good out there, but what am I good for? All right, who am I? What am I good for?
Yeah.
And the search for what I'm good for could in turn lead towards thinking about the good as such. And I agree with Jose about the corrupting influence of practicality on education for its own sake and the kind of human good that can come from it. Having said that, I'm a practical guy, and my students are all practical people. Somebody's got to pay the rent. Jamie, would you like to jump in on this?
Well, I would only insofar as I could epitomize, I think, a little bit of what Miss Brand argued in her book, because she does call it paradoxes, and that means there are things that are very puzzling about it. But one of them is the notion that the useless education turns out to be more useful than the useful education does, because as Amy said, the things that are needed in the world of practical accomplishment are often those very things of curiosity, quickness to learn, openness of mind, and I would also say a good grounding in certain very basic things like mathematics that are absolutely essential to going out. But then she argues essentially that proper education in a republic should include a period during late adolescence, early adulthood, of reflection on the question of ends, which is best accomplished through the reading of these core texts of the tradition, and perhaps in our time a more global, I think of a more global outlook in other traditions as well, as broadly as we can identify the appropriate texts and as much as we can have time for. But the argument there in now in practical terms is that following that period of education, that 4 years or whatever it is, that we should then expect, of course, that these students will be capable of quickly acquiring the necessary practical knowledge to contribute to a field of endeavor, whether it's business or whether it's the military or whether it's medicine or law or what have you. And that we really need to think about those as separate things. Now, my college tried to do that through having a separate general studies curriculum, which initially was supposed to occupy about half of the students' time. But as the college tried to grow itself into a university with more and more and more specialized programs and schools directed at physical therapy and all these kinds of things, that general education ideal was first of all, it was encroached upon so that the half became a much smaller fraction, and the real half, even that fraction was reduced to really what amounted to no more than a quarter of the time the students spent on it.
All right.
Anyway, my point is that you see, it's the separation of the concept of the practical learning from this inquiry, this more basic exposure, and
All right.
call it tradition if you like. I sort of like that term because it suggests that there's something that's handed down to us from the past, much like Thucydides giving us that something for all time. And I think
It
that's
is
a concept.
now my duty, because they told me I'm supposed to keep everything on schedule, to bring all this to a close. Look, I've been doing professional education for the last 20 years. I'm about to retire so I can go back to liberal education. So it has been truly liberating for me to meet everyone on the panel. I'm grateful for your participation and for supporting ACTC, and we have to end.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing this, and it's been
Thank you.
very, very
Thank you.
enlightening talk. Thank you so much.
Yes,
Thank you
indeed.
so much.
Thank
Hi,
you.
so I'm the one kicking you out, so sorry. If you would like, I've enjoyed this very much, though I didn't have anything particularly to contribute. If you would like to continue conversation as it's going, do remember we have the mingle function in the agenda. It's awkward, we all know that, but it is the best thing we have for informal conversation there. And now that we all know each other and, you know, we're on first name basis, it's significantly less awkward than any other time. So if you would like to continue conversation, that is available. It's right under the same panel where you saw the agenda to come see this here today. So just a reminder. Thanks.
Well,
guys.
thanks for making it run so smoothly.
Thank you. Yeah, this
Yeah,
was great.
really.
You did it yourself.
I'm glad you had my back.
Goodbye, everyone.
You everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye now.
Goodbye.